Welcome to the Expert Series, where we explore the issues shaping Canada's national defense and security. I'm Josh Malm, Director of Research and Analysis for the CDA Institute. Jim Fergusson joined us again today to discuss Canada-U.S. collaboration in the Arctic and its continued importance despite ongoing shifts and tension in the bilateral relationship. Jim and I also talked about the conservative spending plan for Arctic defense and the need for a permanent base in Nunavut, challenges in Arctic defense infrastructure, including local recruitment and environmental constraints. And then Jim and I also talked about U.S. Canada defense collaboration in the Arctic more broadly and its continued importance with geopolitical challenges. James Fergusson is the former director of the Center for Defense and Security Studies at the University of Manitoba. This is the Expert Series. So, as our listeners would know, Pierre Poilievre made a spending announcement for our Arctic defense. I'm wondering if you might be able to pick apart some aspects of that announcement and maybe you could comment on whether you think they hit the nail on the head there, if these plans are feasible, and then maybe you could finish by talking about investments that they may have missed or that might also be good to consider.
Well, his announcement talked about establishing the key message was to establish a Canadian Forces base in the Arctic, in Nunavut. And then if you read a little closer, he's talking about Iqaluit. That is important, but there's always a big but in these things. As a function of the acquisition of the F-35s and the forward operating locations, which Iqaluit is one, the other three are Inuvik, Yellowknife, and Goose Bay. Because of the security requirements from the United States for the F-35, they really have to build a base up there. And the government knows this. Now, the issue becomes when he talks about a base relative to the security requirements of a separate installation to manage potentially forward deployed F-35s, what is the difference between the two? And that's unclear. And there are a lot of big issues when it comes to establishing a permanent presence up there. Will affect the armed forces greatly. So until we know exactly what is meant, as we always like to say, the devil's in the details. If you're talking about a permanent defense installation, like a base in Winnipeg or in Ottawa or in Trenton, well, you're going to have personnel deployed permanently up there. And that becomes a big issue because who in the South with their families want to go up to Iqaluit and do what? There's no jobs, and there's going to be a strain on the local infrastructure, sewers, water, housing. So this is a major undertaking. Now, the government is already committed to this with NORAD modernization that goes back to 2022. So they're committed. So he agrees with them, but he seems to say that they're going to go a little further. And if they're going to go a little further for the permanent establishment, what they need to do is start right now recruiting local, indigenous, community people, train them, get them security clearances so they can do this. Because if you ask any family down here with a military husband or wife, they're going to go up there and do what? So the devil is in the details on this. But it's certainly important that these installations need to be expanded and dealt with in terms of American security conditions related to the F-35. And they're not, let me add this, they're not unique to Canada. Anyone who acquires the F-35, whether part of the consortium, which Canada is, or not, such as Israel or Turkey, they have to follow these rules. Otherwise, game's over with the Americans. So we'll see. We'll see. But let me add one other thing. This has been a long-standing conservative commitment. You go back to Diefenbaker and the True North idea that he had. Ended up building a highway to nowhere out of Yellowknife. And the Harper government, of course, the Canadian First Defense Strategy and his emphasis in the Arctic. So this is central to a conservative platform. But the problem with the Conservatives, with the current Liberal government, and we've seen this over and over again for years, is do you follow through? Because Harper didn't. And because of economic considerations, he started to cut budgets, and that killed that dead, except for the Arctic patrol vessels. So that went forward. But I agree with their position. But again, what's going to happen when we play this all out? We'll have to wait and see.
There's many, many steps involved, a lot of infrastructure that needs to be undertaken, and you're looking at maybe a potentially decade to decades long timeline, maybe to even get started on the basics here. That's what it kind of sounds like.
Well, yeah, because you've got a very limited construction season. Uh, you've got to bring this all up by water in the summer when it's open. And there are other demands, of course, for the indigenous and local communities, because that's how they get resupplied. Uh, so this will be a strain, and there'll be lots of money. So I hope they proceed with it. Of course, the other issue involved here, which he didn't talk about, was further north to Alert and the location of the polar over the horizon radar system, where that's going. Estimates are it'll go to Alert. The only other option you have up there is Resolute Bay, which has a runway and has an Operation Nanook, the annual exercises the military does up there. They employ it up there, but it's not a runway that can take F-35s because it's just a gravel runway. It can take Hercs and Globemasters because they can land in this and go. So that it would have to pave this, and that's not a cheap. This is a lot of money with an uncertain economy, given this issues which we have with the United States.
That's a good point at which we can kind of transition here to the next topic. I don't know if we want to necessarily construe Poilievre's announcement as part of his greater sort of conservative campaign, but it does come at a very interesting time. We have the current state of the relationship with the United States. We have all the things Trump has been saying, whether or not he's serious, we don't know. But you also have a liberal leadership campaign, and probably sooner rather than later, we'll be having an election. You know, so it comes out at an interesting time. To what extent do you think that maybe defense, security, Canada's sovereignty might be a more palpable election issue this time around than it has been in the past few decades, if at all?
0 to none. Simple as that. We've seen this before, repeats all the time, but they're never major. The key issue will be the economic question between Canada and the United States. Oh, excuse me.
Sorry.
That will drive this. Defense and security will be a minor part. Generally, if you look at voting patterns, there is a small portion of the Canadian public, the attentive defense community, whether it's on the left or in the right, ex-military, et cetera, and the military itself, they will be likely attracted to this issue. But the whole majority of the public is now focused upon the economic relationship with the United States. And there's nothing I've seen that would indicate to me that despite Trump's making these references to that, they're defending us whether we like it or not. We've seen nothing that suggests that the current status of the relationship, NORAD in particular, is on the table. If you go back to 2017, Trump's first administration and his first summit with Justin Trudeau, both agreed there's a sentence in there that talks about NORAD modernization and value of that relationship that's not going to change. So we've seen nothing about that. So I don't think there's going to be any, even if NORAD, they decided we've had enough of NORAD, they cannot defend themselves without us. So what you will go back to pre-1957 and the air defense, aerospace defense relationship of bilateral agreements, which already govern the land and maritime sector. So my view is that this is probably going to be status quo. We are investing. The danger for Canada is that we are so emotionally involved with the Americans on this issue. I mean, the foolish things. I'll give you an example. All the school divisions in Winnipeg have all put pause on their trips to the United States. Take a breath, everyone. Take a breath. This will all work itself out. Do not fold up your tent with the Americans. They recognize the significance. And it's important to remember that at the executive level, prime minister, president, secretaries to ministers, that's one thing. But the relationship in defense has always operated beneath the radar. And both sides realize the importance of each other. So this will sort itself out. I think it will sort itself out. We've already committed significant amount of dollars, which I assume the Conservative government will follow through and maybe even more money. And don't go to 2% of GDP. That's freaking foolishness on the part of Mark Carney in particular. We couldn't spend 2% of GDP in 5 years. We have no chance to spend it because of the system up here. So everyone, so calm down. The system is very, how would I put it, very structured. Structure's not the, has buffers and strengths on both sides. And there's that healthy, long-standing military to military relationships that have gone on for decades now. That is a buffer to the executive. So one of the things I like to point out to people is that Trump can say what he wants. We can say what they want. But whether this will get implemented by the people who implement this is a different story. They will likely stall. Oh yeah, we'll look into this. So it's not as bad as everyone thinks it is. The economic front is a different game, though.
Refreshing take to compared to some of the other takes lately I think we've heard. And I think you raised some really important points there, especially about us not losing our heads. While what President Trump says is influential in a lot of ways, I think it's important to know about it's important for our audience to still consider the longstanding defense relationship and economic relationship Canada and the United States have had. Um, um, that aside, Trump's comments, again, whether serious or not, have, I think, put a bit of a spotlight again on the Arctic and the North. We're seeing this sort of ramping up of great power competition and interest from states like China and Russia in the Arctic and in the United States as well. I'm wondering if you can speak to our audience a little bit about the sort of maybe emerging geopolitical arena that is the Arctic and what challenges, Canada in particular faces up there and, what you think maybe are the biggest challenges.
Well, the biggest challenge on the defense front is that we face an aerospace threat. Cruise missiles, hypersonics, ballistic missiles. And it's important for Canada to get fully engaged, which is an issue for our no to participation in the American strategic missile defense capability. That's got to move, and it's already moving. The issues, I should say, the statements that have come out, particularly in the updated defense policy, about us engaging in integrated air and missile defense, which is a big thing driven by the Americans. We need to realize we need to engage across the board and then discuss with the Americans and negotiate with the Americans. What can we do? What can they do? And how we balance all this. So I think that's in the cards and it's playing itself out. The key thing sort of in all this is we have committed significant dollars. It's a question of follow through. And the Canadian governments are not good following through on defense because it's not a politically salient issue to them. And I think one of the messages from Trump and the administration right now is They don't mention what commitments the current government has made, but we need to, in fact, Trump will make us follow through. So the irony of all this, in my view, is that Trump is good for us on the defense and security side of the equation. He's making us grow up and be more responsible. So we've had $1 billion, I don't know how many billion, 1 or 2 billion invested in border security, even though we had close relations with the Americans in the international border enforcement teams between American and Canadian police. We've been doing this for a long time, but now we're exacerbating it, playing it up. And so my view is that the key question is, and we don't know what the economy is going to do, and that's always a problem, but we need to follow through. If there's a message to the current government, to the future liberal leader, or to Pierre Poilievre, commit to follow through. Do what we haven't done for so many decades. Yak and do nothing.
You've been talking a bit about U.S. Canada collaboration on Arctic security. I'm wondering if, for our listeners, you might be able to delineate the responsibilities of each of our respective countries. So, where does the U.S. contribute to the security of the Arctic? Where does Canada contribute, and how can we continue contributing effectively together and take on specific sort of roles?
Well, the key thing for us, remember, the United States in the Arctic is Alaska. We'll forget about the Greenland game. That's sort of entertaining. At least I like Trump because he's entertaining. It's like reality TV ongoing. But the key thing is surveillance, all domain awareness. If you go back and look at the NORAD modernization announcement, the chief of the defense staff, General Eyre at the time, talked about 10-2, that we were going to be responsible for 10-2. So basically, if you look at the an Arctic map, what we're talking about is basically from Alaska down through Labrador is going to be our responsibility. We already contribute to this, for example, through the RadarSat program. RadarSat provides wide area surveillance, so we can find shipping going on. We can see this with the 3-bird constellation. And that, of course, is then exchanged with the Americans, and that's an important capability. Also, and again, this is a question of follow-through. Also, in the case of the commitments, this is the enhanced surveillance capability, space-based surveillance capability. I don't know if it's going to be expanded. RadarSat constellation, I just don't know. They haven't said anything about what they're going to do. But that will give us more 24/7. Right now, we don't have 24/7 surveillance of the Arctic. My expectation is that that's what they're planning to do. So that covers a big gap. The Americans will deal with 10 around the underside to 2 to handle that. And that's where NORAD becomes central because it is the core aerospace warning capability. And that will extend into the maritime sectors as well. Not the land sectors, because no one's going up there. Even with climate change, which is a problem. I understand that. But it's still freaking cold up there. It's winter, it's dark. So that we do make a key contribution. We need to make more contributions. We need, as I said, we need to follow through. If you look at the 2022 announcement in June, and then the follow-on details, not great details from D&D about what they were going to do, we need to ensure that this all happens. We cannot be laggards on this because that will increase the propensity of the United States to, and this is the danger, to become more unilateral. We'll do what we want. We're not going to tell you anymore what you want. And our leverage on this, because we're an important piece of territory, real estate for them, is you need to know what we're doing, and we need to know what you're doing. And we need to coordinate all this. Follow through is the key word to me. And I'm not necessarily sanguine we will follow through because this, as I like to say, this is Canada,
Hoping we can sidestep the Arctic for just a quick little aside here before we kind of get back into it. You mentioned that word unilateral. It looks to many onlookers and observers, at least in the media, that we might be seeing a rather, a bit of a departure in U.S. foreign policy generally, and that of course means vis-a-vis Canada as well. How significant would you say this sort of apparent departure or changes if we want to think about past historical shifts in U.S. foreign policy and vis-a-vis Canada too? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think I've suggested in some things I've written in the past that why do we think the American global presence is forever and ever amen? Why do we think that NATO will never die? The world's changing. You have someone who has a revolutionary, very nationalist perspective on American interests. And the irony of all this is that you look at the Canadian uh, narrative that's gone on with the economic side, we're suddenly becoming highly nationalist as well. The danger of all this for us is renationalization of defense in North America. I don't think it's going to come to that, but that's part of the problem, particularly in terms of ensuring that we have access to American thinking and planning, operational doctrine, intelligence. And we lose that, we're in serious trouble. But we are not Europe. We are not the Asia Pacific. We are stuck here, living beside the Americans. And I suspect at the end of the day, you could have a revolutionary change. And I don't use the term isolationist United States, but they're going to pull back and expect the allies. But again, that's not unique. You could go back, for example, to 1969 and the Nixon Doctrine. And it's been repeated in the Americans. The problem with the Americans is they never followed through. They couldn't break from the past, which is World War II. And now we might be at a point where they're going to break from the past. They can break from the past overseas. They can't break from the past with us. And they're going to recognize this, I think. And it depends how skilled negotiators we are. But take a breath, everyone. And we'll see how this all plays out. And the interesting thing, I know this is a side thing, the current discussions between the Secretary of State and the Russian Foreign Minister on Ukraine. Everyone's up in arms about, oh, how could you do this? Where's Ukraine? Da, 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 da. Well, I hate to tell them that the traditions in international politics is great powers decide. They're the ones who decide what they're going to do. And the issues between us and the Americans and the Russians, which has impact on the Chinese and the Indians, are more important than Ukraine or Israel and Gaza. These are the big plays. And all we can do is play at the margins as best as we can, which means keeping open access to the Americans.
Hoping we can revert back to speaking briefly about the geopolitical importance of the Arctic once again. I want to dig out whether or not you feel like, for lack of better eloquent phrasing at this moment, is the Arctic and its geopolitical significance to you adequately hyped? Meaning, there's talk of trade routes opening up and how lucrative they will be. There's talk of Russian, Chinese, American interest in the Arctic, and the position that kind of leaves Canada in. Some might envision a sort of jostling for power in the region. Do you think that's how it's going to play out, like a big geopolitical jostle in the region? And what do you see happening in the region in the next, 10 to 15 years or so geopolitically? Hard as that may be to predict. So I just lobbed a bunch of questions at you, but I'm hoping you can parse through those for us.
Well, first of all, I would say all the focus on the Arctic is overhyped. It's way out of whack. You got to remember the climate's up there. You got to remember the reality up there. It's dark for half the year, and then it's sunlight for half the year. The economic interest, particularly for Russia and the Eastern Passage, which is going to be more lucrative and open before the Northwest Passage ever is, as far as I understand the physics of all ice and ice flows. That's an important economic variable for the Russians. And we need to understand that. This is vital to their economic well-being. Uh, the Chinese wish to play, but what are they going to play at in there? They're interested, if you look in terms of their Silk Road ideas, the Arctic Silk Road. This will enable goods to move quicker between Asia and Europe and the eastern seaboard. I think at the end of the day, there is, if it already doesn't exist, a tacit understanding that there's nothing to fight over up there about. Now, it's important for our defense because of the threats, the aerospace threats, the cruise missiles, hypersonics, they're going to fly over there if things go bad elsewhere in the world and it escalates. That's important and why we need to invest in defense and security up there. But in terms of the idea that somehow the clash of great power interests, China, Russia, and the United States, is in itself going to be a spark for a major confrontation, I think is way overblown. I think we need to get back, in my view, uh, to very old historical great power politics, because that's what everyone calls the system right now, great power politics. We can have differences over Ukraine and the Russians, over the Middle East, over issues in the Asia Pacific. But that should not then stop us and the Russians and the Americans and partially on the margin. One thing I should add as a side point, the Russians are as deeply concerned about the Chinese as we are. They just won't say it. That we need to re-engage through the Arctic Council. We need to re-engage with senior Russian military officials and our senior military officials to develop confidence building measures in the Arctic so we don't have accidents. We don't screw this up there. And people criticize this idea that the Arctic should be a sanctuary. For a right reason, it should be a sanctuary. Now, if things go bad elsewhere in the world, is going to affect the Arctic and the politics up there. But for the time being, this is an avenue, in fact, where could be used to explore enhancing or improving or having some dialogue with the Russians. And I think that's an important step. Bold government with leadership needs to step out and do. Unfortunately, this is Canada. We don't have bold leadership ever. Sorry to be critical. They're going to take my citizenship away one day.
No, Jim, that's great. Listen, this has been a great discussion. We're at about time here, almost half an hour. We spent a lot of time talking geopolitics and the U.S. Canada relationship in the Arctic this time. We talked a bit about the Poilievre conservative spending announcement. Just wanted to hand it back to you once more before we wrap up. Do you have any final thoughts or anything you wish to speak of that we didn't get a chance to talk about that you think might be important?
Well, two things. One, I think as there is more military investment, defense investment in the Arctic, there certainly has to be clear engagement with the local indigenous, not just the indigenous, but the local communities. You need to think about them to recruit them into the military and train them, get them security clearances, because those are the people that need to be doing this in the Arctic, not bringing people up from the south for 2 years and moving them back south again. You need to establish that foundation and then deal with the costly issues of water, sewer, housing. And it's got to be, and I hate the term whole of government, because one of the problems with the Arctic is there's too many government actors with too many different jurisdictions playing with one another, fighting with one another. And you need something. And I don't like the term, but I think about the fentanyl czar. You need an Arctic czar to come in from the feds and say, okay, we're going to bring all this together and we need a coherent approach, because D&D will say, well, the indigenous stuff, the local stuff, waters, that's not our problem. What is your problem? So that's one of the important things, I think, that the government needs to recognize and restructure itself to deal with the Arctic and engage the local communities. And there's lots, I think, steps that can be taken. The second thing I would add is one of the announcements Polyev made was to expand the Rangers. What are they going to do? This is a problematic one to me. When you go back to the birth of the Rangers decades and decades ago, we had no modern technology, no modern surveillance capability, and they were vitally important because they're the only ones who knew what the hell was going on up there. Well, now we have a variety of air, space, future land capabilities, which can do all this surveillance. So I don't know if it's a make work exercise for the local communities, but they'd be better invested elsewhere in support of the military than by simply expanding the Rangers.
Jim, great to have you on. Great to see you again. You always make me think when we have you on the podcast, so thank you for that. Thank you for sharing your thought leadership and your very interesting perspectives with us for the podcast, and hope to have you on again soon.
Anytime. My pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter and be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast platform so that you never miss an update. For more in-depth analysis and updates on national security and defense, be sure to visit our website at www.cdainstitute.ca, where you can find articles, reports, and more. Thanks, and we hope you'll be tuning in next time.